4-year crop, and so there's a fallow year. During that fallow year, most of the farmers have been in the habit of just burning it down, leaving it bare. It goes right into the ditches, into the canals, and into the bayous. But he is also finding that the legumes hold the cover, or hold the soil, and best of all, they have the ability to take from the atmosphere the nitrogen and store it down in their roots, in the little nodules. So the farmer brought in a picture of some of the soil and was all excited and said, "Look at the nodules." And I could see in the picture these beautiful, storage houses of nodules of nitrogen. And they were very proud that they were putting this back into their soil. In our area, there is some thought being given to Conf, which would be a transition crop in some way from sugarcane. And some of the farmers have taken the risk of investing in planting Conf. And we have a small Conf plant that has been struggling to survive in our parish. Those are the kinds of sustainable, I'd say, roads to sustainability that the whole community needs to support and to know about. Another sign of progress in our area of Acadiana, we have some farmers who've been meeting, getting new ideas, sharing their successes through a Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, and so they call themselves Acadiana Sustainable Ag Working Group. If any of you want to be in touch with the lead person there, his name is Vinton, and his number is in the area 318, and it's 365-1787. Now there are some organic farmers in Louisiana who have come forward and have begun to look at networking, as well as to form an association of organic growers. The Louisiana Department of Agriculture has upgraded an organics definition to standards for organic farming in Louisiana. And Louisiana now has an organic certification program. Now you can get a packet of information about the organic certification program from Peter Grandi at the Department of Agriculture. And his number is in the area 505-925-6914. 504. I'm sorry, 504. Here's the preacher.
Could you repeat the number?
504-925-6914.
His full name?
Peter.
Petrie?
Peter, P-E-T-E-R,
Yeah.
Grandi.
Grant.
G-R-A-N-D-I.
Thank you.
And he will be very helpful if you want him to come to your area. He will come and talk to you, or talk to a group. I spoke with him the other day, and it sounded like he would be most happy to do that. Yesterday, I spoke with an organic farmer in the Crowley area. Now, he's looking for Louisiana farmers to produce organic soybeans. He has the market for them, but now he needs to fill the market and get organic soybeans. The bottom price would be $10 a bushel. And of course, as most of us know, soybeans are around 5 if you're doing well, and 10 would be the bottom, so it would be worth looking into. If you want to call him and get details about it, you can call him. His name is Shelton Fontenot. I believe that's Fontenot. He's in my area, in the 318, and his number is 666-2219. So we do have some courageous and knowledgeable farmers out there, and right here at our meeting. You're going to hear from some more of them later on. A regional sustainable ag working group has formed in a 13-state southern area. The Southern group I will call SOG in order to save time. And it's a coalition of 46 organizations working together for more sustainable agriculture in these states. We have 5 organizational members in Louisiana, including Lean, here today, and Southern Mutual Health Association. And I don't know if there's anyone else, I believe not. The Southern SOG has several current programs which address some of the crises which I have mentioned. And one of the crises is research. And they have a public research and education accountability project. They have a marketing, information, and education project. And then they have a national agricultural policy project. The Southern SOG has been able to put sustainable farmers on the regional USDA administrative committee. So it's kind of been putting in some grassroots people who know what their problems are and know what the solutions are into some of the positions where they can say this and they can demonstrate. We feel that some of those bureaucracies have been far too long without the grassroots farm people that know the problems and know some solutions can be there and tell them that they need these solutions and they need research for it. We have several very competent advocates for policy and practices to ensure safety and education about pesticide contamination and poisoning. And one such organization is here today and has been a great help to our area and certainly to my organization. And that is the National Coalition Against the Misuse of Pesticides. And you'll be hearing from Jay Feldmen later today. Jay his organization has also been instrumental in making this conference possible here today. We have some universities who are assuming a role in leadership to prepare students for a more sustainable agriculture. USL in Lafayette has a great department known as the Department of Renewable Resources. And Griff Blakewood there, I think he wanted to come today, but it was a little too far. But he comes to all these kinds of gatherings and brings students. Southern University has some excellent work going on in promoting sustainable practices.
Hi, you want to take a picture? You just have to center and focus. Okay. It's not yours.
Okay, we're ready to get started again.
I think I don't.
Our next speaker is Jay Feldmen, Director of the National Coalition Against the Misuse of Pesticides in Washington, D.C. He's going to talk about what you should know about food safety and cancer-causing pesticides. You know, sometimes we think about people in D.C. as just in the Beltway, never talking to us, you know, out there in the information highway, and I can't relate to the grassroots folks. But I have to tell you, Jay is someone who's been there for the grassroots folks. I have had a lot of phone calls from people who've been exposed to pesticides, and they'll say, this is what they sprayed. Is this going to affect my health? Does it have any long-term effects on my body? What can I do? One phone call to Jay's organization. Invaluable, and we thank you very much. We'll give you a warm welcome, Jay.
Thank you. Well, it is great to be here, and I wanted to give you a little bit of perspective on my life and tell you what I'm missing today. My 8-year-old is on a baseball team, and I'm missing his baseball game. And I want to tell you that I really feel like I need something in return for that, because that really means a lot to me. Of you, because I think it's even more important actually than his baseball game, and that is your involvement in a process that goes on around policymaking. And hopefully by the time I finish talking and describing to you what from our perspective is going on, I will have convinced you that not only do you need to sit down and write a letter to somebody who will discuss that as well. We heard earlier, and the theme I think today has been a very with people on a range of problems, people who we don't necessarily typically communicate with, to solve problems. Isn't always a solution. That government involvement is not always a solution. And what I want to amplify on those themes. But I also want to assure you that if government is not made to work for you, I mean all of you in this room, you can be assured that it's working for some. Maybe working for, maybe not. There are policy implications that stand behind those problems, that have allowed those problems to manifest themselves. Whether you're a consumer concerned about safe food, or a farmer concerned about getting off the pesticide treadmill, finding alternative solutions to pest problems, or you're a state employee and you believe that there aren't sufficient resources dedicated to working on alternatives, you can help me out this morning and sit down and express those concerns in the form of a letter. Now, the reason I say this is because we heard during the last presidential campaign all this talk about lobbyists in alligator shoes running around Capitol Hill and in Washington influencing public policy and decisions and so forth. And that's a phenomenon that goes on, and those people are very influential. But I believe the people in this room, that you, your friends and neighbors and relatives, are much more influential when it comes to finding solutions to the problems and influencing policy. One of the things that's clear, I think, when we look at various issues and problems, I mean, probably the clearest problem that can be put into perspective is, say, war. When we go into a war, we have very clear goals about winning those wars historically, and we rally as a country behind the goal of winning wars. We have a war that we're engaged in right now, I think, in this country, for this country's health, for the health of the people, for the health of the environment. But we don't have a clear sense of what the goal of that war is, and I don't think we all have a clear sense of how we're going to win that war. Part of what I'd like to discuss today are sort of the elements and the tactics associated with what that war is, why there's a war going on, and how we all have to contribute to winning that war. We right now have no national goals when it comes to pesticide control, when it comes to the adoption of alternative methods for growing food, for growing cotton, whatever it is. And the goals of a nation really start at the community level. What do we want? What do we want for our families? What do we want for our children? If we don't express those concerns and that sense, no matter what occupation we're in, we will never have those national goals. We will have a bunch of bureaucrats running around trying to fund their programs without any national goals. We will have policies that are driven by what the chemical companies think are in their interest for next quarter's profits. We will have no long-term sense of what we as a community or as a nation want to accomplish. Let me try to put this in some perspective, and I will by the end of this tell you who we need to write to, and I'm not going to let you off the hook on that. But just to put this in perspective, you've heard a little bit about this morning. In terms of volume of pesticide use, I just wanted to say that, as Helen said, about a billion pounds of pesticides are used in the conventional sense in this country. That's the right side of the chart, and she mentioned that there are another billion pounds used on the other side of the chart, which is really wood preservatives and disinfectants for the most part. But what we come up against on a daily basis are what are known as the conventional pesticides. We shouldn't forget about the disinfectants and wood preservative chemicals. But on the conventional side, there are about 800 million pounds of agricultural chemicals that are used. Now, it's interesting, when you travel around and you talk to agriculture people, you generally get the sense that we as a nation are doing good. We're really making progress. We're getting away from chemical dependency. And we should be proud of ourselves as a nation. Well, a group in Washington called Public Voice for Food and Health Policy in May of 1993 released a report called Agrochemicals in America, Farmers' Reliance on Pesticides and Fertilizers. And they went through all the data on pesticide use and commerce and so forth. And they came up with some very interesting conclusions. Listen to this. On a per acre basis, overall agrochemical use in U.S. agriculture has increased throughout the 1980s and early 1960s. The report concludes, different categories of agrochemicals have experienced different growth rates in the past decade. Fungicide use has doubled. Herbicide and fertilizer use has grown slowly, and insecticide use has remained stable, following a decline in the 1980s during the banning of toxaphene. So most of the decline was actually tied to one insecticide. Most disturbing, and this is my view here, most disturbing is the fact that the percent of cropland treated with agricultural chemicals is on the rise. So although overall poundage may be down or stable in the insecticide area, first of all, two things are happening. We're going to more potent chemicals. We can use now about an ounce per acre, whereas years ago we used pounds per acre. The more important element we need to look at if we're going to get back to my original challenge to this community, but to the nation as a whole, is how do we develop national goals? The real question should be, is our reliance within agricultural systems on pesticide inputs increasing? And the answer to that, according to Public Voice, is yes. From 1969 through 1987, the percentage of cropland treated with agrochemicals increased 131.3% for fungicides, 81.3% for herbicides, 58.4% for insecticides, and 32.6% for chemical fertilizers. The chemical companies are doing a very good job of selling their product. So there are a number of elements you need to look at. This chart talks about overall poundage of use. We also, if we're going to look at our national goals, we need to consider our reliance, our dependency on chemical inputs in agricultural systems. And we're not doing a very good job as a nation. Now, I want to explain to you that, and this is key, again, how we formulate a national goal and how would this community want to formulate that goal. What are you going to put in your letter that we're going to write? As a country, we are using almost 700 different kinds of pesticides, and the vast majority of those chemicals have never been fully tested for cancer, birth defects, genetic damage, neurological impacts, ecological effects. They were allowed on the market back in the 1940s under laws that simply did not require full testing. They were to be upgraded in their testing in the early 70s, and this has simply never happened. That's part of the story. So if you try to, on paraquat for example, try to find out everything you want to know about that chemical, you will find out that the government, which registers these chemicals, does not have complete information. That doesn't mean we don't know anything about them, but it means that we simply do not have full information. But I want to back up here for a minute. I want to ask the question, what is in a pesticide? We heard this morning reference to paraquat, and I think you said the label was 60-some-odd%? 37% paraquat. The rest of that product was something else. The 37% is called the active ingredient. That's paraquat. Now, understand that this is, we heard about lawyers earlier, this is what the law defines. It's not a reality in terms of what you as a human being are affected by, but the law divides out a pesticide product, a weed killer, into active ingredient, which is the component of the product that attacks the target pest. That's the active ingredient. It's biologically and chemically active against the target, be it a weed, herbicide, or an insecticide against an insect. Then the rest of that product, which is over 60%, is inert ingredient. Now, inert is a word we learned in chemistry classes to be basically harmless. But in this case, it's defined as inert against the target pest. While it may not actually be inert against the target pest, it's not put into the product by the chemical manufacturer to attack the target pest. It can be a carrier, the solution, the chemical that makes the solution, a solvent. It can be the chemical that makes the granule, or the surfactant, the chemical that's put in the solution that makes it stick, the mixing agent. And although this chemical, in most cases, comprises the majority of the product, that in fact is a high percentage of active ingredient. Most pesticides are in the upper ranges of the 80 to 90% inert ingredient. So although they are secret, and although they basically are dismissed as important in view of you, the user, the farmer, the consumer, these chemicals too may be chemically and biologically active. Xylene, benzene have been known to be in these things. Then the other thing to consider in pesticides are contaminants. And this is very important because if I have time, I'll speak a little bit about our work with farmers in Florida, but also in some 40 other states who have experienced problems with a fungicide called Benley, produced by DuPont Chemical Company. Turns out the chemical is contaminated with another, the chemical which is a fungicide is contaminated with a herbicide called sulfonylureas. And just last Friday, I believe, the state of Florida sued DuPont Chemical for misleading farmers of basically deceptive practices, misbranding, mislabeling, under the presumption that DuPont did indeed know that their product was contaminated with a very, very potent herbicide. The impact on farmers, particularly nursery owners, was devastating. This is not devastating in terms of property loss, but also devastating in terms of potential health impact. this is not unique to benylate, and it's a function of the poor manufacturing processes that go on. It's called cross-contamination, where a manufacturer will do one run with one chemical and then take the clean-out material and put it into the next chemical on the run. And EPA has historically allowed what they consider insignificant contaminants to cross-contaminate. So when you come to me and say, they just sprayed and they told me it was paraquat, there could be cross-contamination in that product. There could be all kinds of other things we're coming to find out that we can't identify, but surely the manufacturer knows. And then there's something called metabolites. These are breakdown products. They can be caused as a result of oxidation, being exposed to the air. Malathion, for instance, has a breakdown product called meloxin, which is more toxic than the parent compound. So understand, we're dealing with a very complex set of issues when we talk about pesticide exposure. And this is very important for us to understand, especially when we write our letter later, because we as a consuming public believe, I think we came to believe in the 70s and 80s, that we have a right to know. We have a right to know what's in the food products we buy. Surely many of us read those ingredient statements when we buy food to see what the first ingredient is and to see if there's sugar in it, or if it's high salt, has high sodium content, or if there's something in there that may adversely affect us. Wine is labeled for sulfites because several people have died from sulfite ingestion. But when we pick up a pesticide, we are told, as farmers or as consumers, that you do not have the right to know what you're being exposed to. And then to make matters worse, the government tells us that you don't even have a right to know that there are contaminants in this product, impurities, and that in fact the product you use today may turn into something else tomorrow as a result of its breakdown. So the first point I think we want to make in our letter is that we believe, as consumers living in communities that where pesticides are widely used, that we have a right to know what are in those pesticides. And the farmers in our community want to know what they're using. Because many of our farmers, in fact, have been hurt. And we're aware of the benylate situation in Florida and other states. There are actually probably farmers in Louisiana, particularly in greenhouses, that have also, I know there are in Texas. I've been contacted by Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, North Carolina. I just haven't heard directly from anyone in Louisiana, but I'm sure, I'm confident that farmers, particularly nurserymen in Louisiana, have been affected by benylate. And now point number one, we have a right to know, in this day and age, what chemicals are being used in our communities. Now, we're talking about what we know. And there will be a point in time when we know much more than we know now about pesticides. But that may not help us enough, I don't believe. Because the law that governs, and this is where your involvement in policy is very important, the law that governs, the law that allows that farmer access to that chemical, or you as the homeowner to buy that bathroom disinfectant, or the school to apply an insecticide when your children are sitting in the classroom, the law that governs here is called the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Most of the states, including Louisiana, have mimicked that law at the state level and adopted a form of that law which allows the registration of pesticides in the state, at the state level. It is called a risk-benefit law, and it's a risk-benefit because of the definition here at the bottom of this screen, which is called unreasonable adverse effects. The law, in effect, gives the government and the chemical companies the right to register a pesticide as long as it prevents or protects against an unreasonable adverse effect. And the way that's defined is any unreasonable risk to man or the environment, taking into account economic, social, and environmental costs and benefits of the use of any pesticide. So we have a judgment going on here. A judgment that the risk that you suffer, the risks to the trees on the lake, the risk to your health, the risk to the contamination of groundwater, the risk to worker protection, farm worker protection, that those risks ought to be weighed against some benefit that we derive from using those pesticides. So someone is making that judgment on your behalf. And this is a whole nother discussion that we need to get into. Up until this point, I've been talking about risk issues. And then later we need to talk about the benefit issues. And I'm very happy that we will have a discussion later on about alternatives in cotton in particular. Because much of what we do in this country is premised. Much of the risks we are exposed to is premised on the belief that the chemicals that are being used by that cotton farmer, by that sugarcane grower, whatever it is, that the chemicals that are being used are necessary to meeting pest management goals. And the truth of the matter is, no one in the regulatory process, in the state of Louisiana, at the federal EPA, at USDA, no one has calculated before the chemical was registered or when the chemical was going through re-registration whether that chemical was necessary to meeting the pest management goal. There has been no calculation, there has been no assessment as to whether the introduction of this chemical is necessary to meeting the pest management goal. In fact, the federal law prohibits the federal government from evaluating necessity of pesticides to meeting pest management goals. If there was ever a law that imposed something on you without an assessment as to whether that chemical was necessary, this is the law. So, in effect, what I'm arguing is that another point in your letter ought to be, we don't believe chemicals that are either not fully tested or that have known adverse health effects should be used if they're not necessary to meeting pest management goals. In fact, I heard a cotton farmer and a cotton advisor talk about how we can virtually eliminate some of the most toxic chemicals or reduce significantly, I haven't heard his speech yet, in growing cotton, which is one of the most highly intensive chemical crops in the country in conventional systems. Now, point number two, we don't believe chemicals should be used if they are not necessary.
Excuse me, Jen.
Yeah.
I was just curious, with this law that is so obnoxious to people of the world, or people of this United States, wouldn't it be against just the general, universal, Declaration of Human?
Yeah, there are issues of that, property rights and protection of property and so forth. I mean, there are some constitutional issues here when you get into questions of trespass and what right do you have to protect your property.
I was even talking about beyond the
Yeah.
Constitution.
Let's get back, that's a good discussion point, but let me run through this a little more. You know, if you get an infectious disease, you go to the doctor, you get diagnosed and treated. That disease is reported to the Center for Disease Control. And the reason it's reported is because the government wants to know whether the public health laws are working. They want to know whether the disease you got might affect other people, might be broad-based, might have dramatic community impacts, and whether they need to intervene to protect other people from getting that infectious disease. Well, we have no such reporting in the pesticide area. We register a pesticide, we allow it to be used widely, we don't ask whether the chemical is necessary, and then we do not track whether the chemicals that are out there are hurting trees, hurting people. We don't have an incident monitoring system. We used to actually have an incident monitoring system in this country. It was defunded in the early 80s. It was called PIMS, Pesticide Incident Monitoring System. I talk about it as a sort of a feedback loop. It's sort of a mechanism by which the government and the chemical companies can monitor whether the label, the product label, and the use of their product is having unintended adverse effects. I mean, what could better serve both the chemical companies and government regulators as to have this information? Well, the GAO, the U.S. General Accounting Office, the investigative arm of Congress, basically said that the systems now in place to inventory adverse effects reports, that system doesn't provide complete or accessible information. We simply do not have any tracking of the kinds of problems. So if you call up the state of Louisiana and say, look, I just had this problem, I think it's paraquat, but I can't be sure. Have you had any other reports like this around the state? There's no system of tracking it. And better at the federal level, you know? Our president of our board, her husband died after being exposed to a fungicide on a golf course, chlorthalonil. And the situation is only unique insofar as this situation was recorded and documented. It was recorded and documented because he was a Navy lieutenant, a pilot. He was on vacation for 2 weeks, went out there every day very early in the morning, was literally in the spraying. His clothes were contaminated. He stayed out there for 2 weeks every day, day in, day out. And by the end of that, his skin basically was sloughing off, and no one knew really why. They went back, the Navy did, and took infrared photos. They analyzed his clothing. They established the fact that this man was simply drenched in this chemical. Now, that was a severe reaction, and it also was a severe response. And it also got picked up in the press, so we know about it. But there could be a lot of other responses on golf courses, which is the most intensely, areas that are mostly intensely sprayed with pesticides next to fruit production. Golf courses are more highly dependent on pesticides at this point, most golf courses, than any other land area in the United States. And so this may be happening to a lesser degree, or to some degree, but we have no means of finding this out because it's not reported. Now, I want to spend a little bit more time, because the title of the speech does relate to cancer. I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the data that we've got out there on cancer. And I think probably a lot of you have seen or saw the show on ABC the other night on risk, on which John Stossel from 2020, and then I understand I didn't see the follow-up on Nightline, they looked at this whole question of risk, and are we fearful of things we ought not to be fearful of because the risks are really not worth worrying about. I guess his conclusion was that auto accidents and maybe smoking were the highest risks, and the other risks like toxic waste dumps, pesticides, and some other things came in so low that you really didn't need to worry about it. They were looking at deaths, basically cancer deaths and so forth, and other deaths from accidents. And the data they presented as the operating assumption of the show really belies a lot of the data that's coming in from epidemiologists and researchers from across the country. For instance, in the country today, as most of you probably know, if you haven't been touched by it, probably a member of your family has, 1 in 8 women in this country get breast cancer. That's a really high number. 500,000 Americans will die of cancer this year. Another 1 million will find out they have the disease. Since the 1950s, we've seen about a 20% increase in childhood leukemia. Since 1950, the incidence of different forms of cancer has also increased. Bladder cancer is up 55%, testicular cancer is up 115%, skin cancer is 321%, kidney cancer 109%, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is what this slide's about, is 158% increase. Now, this is a study that the National Cancer Institute did among farmers in Nebraska. They also did a follow-up of this in Kansas, and they confirmed that farmers that use 2,4-D suffer elevated rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. 2,4-D, a widely used herbicide. Now, epidemiology is an interesting science. It's really dependent on getting data that tries to isolate an exposure with use and then an adverse effect, in this case cancer. It's very hard to do, especially in the chemical area, where farmers have a whole bunch of other